The Pac-12 has announced an alliance with the Big Ten and ACC conferences coming Tuesday morning, late morning, afternoon time. And I wanted to break down this news, kind of get into our reactions, what it means for the Ducks, the Pac-12, college athletics. This conversation could go anywhere. I'm here with Ducks Digest reporter Dylan Rubenking to kind of break this all down and get our thoughts out there. Dylan, let's just kind of hop into it here. Maybe just some broad strokes reactions off the bat to this news.
Yeah, so when I first heard the news of the Big Ten, the Pac-12, and the ACC talking about an alliance, given the college football landscape specifically and what's been going on with the college realignment talks and the college football playoff expansion talks, I kind of thought, like you probably did as well, and a lot of people listening might as well, about like a merger. Like, is this going to become the new super conference? And that's 41 schools. So it was kind of unlikely that that was going to be the case. And thankfully, it's not for people who were against that idea. I do think that it was slightly overblown with the amount of hype that it's been getting. I think there's some significance to it with scheduling and recruiting, and we'll get to that a little bit. But I do think that in terms of college football, I think it's just really a couple games each season. And then for basketball, maybe a couple tournaments, challenges like they've already formed and that kind of stuff. So I think it is important to talk about, but I was, a lot of people were kind of expecting a little bit more from this alliance. And it's just a really interesting topic and interesting timing. So I'm interested in getting into it.
41 schools. I think it was around 27,000 student athletes is a lot to talk about or a lot to take in when you're looking at this news. Certainly interesting coming on the heels of Texas and Oklahoma going to the SEC. If you want to look at it as a counterpunch of sorts, but you like to see this kind of a move because the other conferences, particularly the Pac-12, if we're looking at this from an Oregon angle, West Coast angle, you can't afford to just sit around and sit idly by while moves like this happen. And I think I really liked what I heard from George Kliavkoff. Is that how you say it? I think I'm already butchering it. Kliavkoff?
I believe so.
Kliavkoff? Okay, we'll roll with that. We'll adjust as needed. I liked with how he handled himself. He didn't shy away from any questions from reporters. And I liked, how he was talking about how he just wanted to be open about saying that the Pac-12 completely supports the expansion of the college football playoff. Not that anyone really needed to second guess that, but it was nice to hear him reaffirm that belief, seeing that no one's been to the playoffs since I believe it was 2017 when Washington went. And especially when you're looking at a conference that's kind of good, not great, and doesn't really have one dominant team. You've seen the Ducks coming in at number 11 there on the AP Top 25 preseason poll.
Yeah, so I think, in terms of football, this is definitely an interesting move and an interesting timing of it, given, like you said, the Texas and Oklahoma stuff. Somebody asked in that presser about if this was a counterpunch of sorts to that Texas-Oklahoma move. And they said not exactly because, they still think that the Big 12 can handle itself on its own. And, that's a debate in itself. But, the SEC is going to probably double its revenue with the powerhouses of Texas and Oklahoma coming in. And like you said, the Pac-12 kind of needed to make a move. They couldn't sit by and let that kind of thing happen. ACC as well. I mean, ACC for football is really just controlled by Clemson and maybe Florida State if we're talking about financially and kind of the face of the ACC. But in terms of other sports, I mean, the Pac-12 is up there in terms of baseball and softball and women's basketball. You can make the argument for men's basketball given the tournament success last year. So I think outside of just football, this is a really interesting move. I don't know how much it goes outside of basketball and football just yet. I think George Kliavkoff talked about like field hockey and soccer and that kind of stuff as well, but that kind of remains to be seen. So there's a lot up in the air. But I think in terms of football, this could boost the Pac-12 in the long term.
Yeah, a lot of stuff going on as far as, outside of the major sports of football and basketball. Just to stay on that point for a second, I think one of the cool points that you're looking at with the Pac-12 here is obviously the focus is, basketball and football, like we said, but the Pac-12, say what you will about its perception nationally. There was some talk today about the Olympic sports and how, they're trying to put some attention there. the Pac-12 has done very well with regard to the Olympic sports. You're looking at schools like UCLA with water polo, Stanford and Cal, I know, have really strong swimming programs. Those are just kind of some of the ones off the top of my head. A lot of good softball teams and baseball teams as well. So, while this is a move that I think it's fair to say is primarily geared towards the main sports of football and basketball, I think that the Pac-12 definitely has a lot to bring to the table when you're looking at some of the Olympic sports as well. So it was cool to hear that those ones won't be forgotten about, and can certainly bring something to the table with this news.
And what I've been reading about since this news kind of broke was that the Pac-12 has kind of been driving the boat in terms of the alliance talks. They've really only been going for a couple of weeks. But the one thing that kind of caught my eye was, I believe it was Jim Phillips, the ACC commissioner, said that we've kind of been married to each other. The commissioners have been married to each other, which I thought was interesting given the fact that they talked about how there's no like actual physical contract. There's no signed agreement. It's just a verbal agreement between the three commissioners. But it's actually been spewed rather recently. And when you kind of go back in the timeline, like 2 weeks, that's pretty close to when the Texas Oklahoma stuff was becoming official. So I really think the Pac-12 drove this, and Pac-12 football really drove this into existence.
Yeah. The Pac-12 football teams, are definitely looking to push ahead in the conversation. And, like we were saying, this is really free flowing. But I think one of the cool parts when we're looking at this is the scheduling implications and the scheduling possibilities. The initial release, said something along the lines of, we don't want to hinder or go against any of the current contractual obligations that are already in place. So that'll be something pretty fun to see shake out. That is going to be easily one of the most difficult parts of this new alliance. And they're saying that they have a working group, I believe, with athletic directors from the conferences. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Dylan. I know you read up a little bit more on this. That is going to be handling the scheduling as far as that goes, but that's going to be, probably one of their biggest priorities out the gate here. But what we were talking about before this is, like, for a team like Oregon that's trying to push ahead and get into that college football playoff conversation, you're going to try to keep those rivalries with teams like Washington and Oregon State. Like, those are the games that, like, fans want to see played. But do you, kind of just could you, I guess is the question, brush a game like a Washington State or an Arizona? Could you just say, I don't want to play that game, and then grab a matchup with a more formidable, more impressive ACC team or a Big Ten team? I think there's so much to talk about there. And I think that goes a lot. Could go a long way with regard to strengthening your schedule. And especially when it comes to these non-con games, but I guess they're becoming non-conference games. It's so much to take in, but maybe let's just talk schedule. How about that? I think that could be really interesting to help the Ducks and other schools, just get better matchups.
Yeah, and in terms of, the college football playoff, in order to be the best, you have to beat the best. And, this year and next year for Oregon, they face Ohio State this year, and they face Georgia next year in a neutral site in Atlanta, Georgia. But that will be huge for the college football implications. In the conference, I think even if they win out in the conference, it's not a guarantee that they could even be, in the conversation for the college football playoff. So, it really is going to come down to that Ohio State game and the next year for Georgia, because the Pac-12 just isn't there in terms of the competition like the Big Ten or the SEC is. So I think once other teams are facing better teams, so let's say Oregon plays, they play USC in a regular season game, and USC plays Alabama and plays them tightly, then that could be a big, resume booster if Oregon beats a USC team that barely lost to an Alabama team who's probably at the top of the country. So for what I've read is that this could be, I think, 2 games every season. So, for example, a Pac-12 team, let's say Oregon, would play one ACC team and one Big Ten team every season, and that would be their 2 non-conference games. I believe George Kliavkoff was talking about how he doesn't really care if any of the 41 schools reach out to, a group of 5 school or an SEC or a Big 12. That'll still be in the books. That's still on the table. But they really want to emphasize, the level of competition, because, Oregon's playing like teams like Stony Brook and Fresno State who, aren't going to boost their resume. So I think overall the non-conference stuff is really going to boost the Pac-12's ability to get into the playoff, and then in the future with a 12-team playoff, they could really boost them and maybe even put 2 teams in the Pac-12 in the playoff.
That puts a little bit of this news into context as far as what tangible difference could we see in a schedule. You're saying one ACC team, one Big Ten team. Another part of this that's interesting to me, that probably doesn't really seem super important to people, is what does this mean for the smaller programs, like the Group of 5 programs, the FCS schools that are honestly, let's be honest, they're kind of just cupcake matchups, toss-ups, just really get warm kind of warm-up games for a lot of these big name schools. And they sign the contract to go and more or less get their butts kicked, but they use that money to fund their football program, which so many of these other programs, football program is how they fund their athletics. So just to kind of go at it from the little man's point of view, this is big news for them as well. It doesn't stop at the Pac-12, ACC, and Big Ten levels, but that's pretty big. Let's see here. I think what's going to be interesting too, to go back to what you were talking about, how there's no written agreement. I think that was one of the weirdest parts of hearing. I was in this Zoom conference before we went to talk to Mario Cristobal after practice today in Eugene, and Kliavkoff was saying there's no written agreement. It's like a verbal agreement, like a gentleman's type of agreement, right? But all the schools, like highest members, basically are all on board with it. So that's interesting. And then what I was going to go from there is, how would this impact a potential conference championship game? Like, we don't really, we know it's an alliance, and they haven't gone as far as saying it is a conference or like a super conference or anything. But I think that it's going to make it really, really interesting when we're coming into, late November, early December, and we're starting to think about who are some potential teams that have earned a spot in the conference title game. And you have Oregon that's playing Ohio State, and then USC is playing, I don't know, like a Michigan or something. Like, I'm not saying that's on the schedule. The Ducks are playing the Buckeyes, but like, Dylan, what I'm trying to say here is, like, how do you think that could kind of have an implication, or, how do you think that could kind of go down? What are your reactions there?
Yeah, I think like with the conference title games, I think that would probably, like, they would remain the same. I think the Pac-12 championship would be based on the performance against other teams in the Pac-12. I think that would probably remain the same. Same thing with the ACC and the Big Ten. I don't know if like those non-conference games would count, if that's kind of what you're talking about, in terms of like counting towards the conference title and the standings.
Yeah, no, as after I said that and heard you talking, I was like, that doesn't really make much sense. I guess what my point was more geared towards the playoff conversation, but also going towards the hypothetical of, if it does become one massive conference, then that would kind of be a point to consider. So just kind of wipe that from the record. That point didn't make any sense. But I feel like I've kind of just been spewing stuff off the top of my head. What's kind of getting your interest with regard to this news?
Well, I think, we talked a lot about the Pac-12, and obviously it's, important for us and our audience to talk about that and talk about Oregon. I think one thing that's going to be really interesting to watch in the next couple of years is what happens with the Big 12, given that Texas and Oklahoma have already bolted for the SEC, and now they're being left out of this, alliance, which I think was obviously on purpose, because why would you pick them up if you can just add on with the ACC and the Big Ten? And the conferences have already talked about, they don't want to poach teams from other conferences. That's not really the point of this. It's just to collaborate and, bring the best out of their student athletes and enhance their opportunities athletically and academically. That was the big emphasis on that. But I don't expect the Big 12 to last much more than this alliance goes on for. I think probably a couple years into it, and a couple years of Texas and Oklahoma being in the SEC, I think the Big 12 goes under, and I feel like one of the Group of 5 conferences becomes a Power 5. If that Power 5, Group of 5 separation kind of format still stays the same, I think with the Super Conference talk, I think all of that kind of washes away. We could maybe see some sort of FBS versus everybody else kind of thing. It's really interesting, given the timing of all the college football playoff and the realignment stuff. It's really interesting that this came now, and it's only been a conversation for a couple weeks. But I think with the scheduling stuff, the Big 12 is definitely at a loss here, and financially they're at a huge loss as well. And with the Big Ten, that was the other thing I wanted to talk about is the Big Ten's TV rights agreement ends in 2023, and the Big Ten already makes far more than ACC or the Pac-12 makes. So once they get a new deal, it makes me wonder what the balance of this is going to be once they kind of make a formal agreement. I don't know how much that would really happen, but I'm really curious to see like if it would still be that alliance if the Big Ten is kind of daunting over the ACC and the Pac-12 financially, because they said it's not based on revenue, but it kind of is.
Yeah, I didn't understand that or really believe it when they were saying like it was kind of like a broad strokes type of deal. Like this move isn't based on revenue or money, but like if you're in tune with college athletics, you know that this is a huge money move. And so much of it has to do with the media rights that are at play. I think that's something myself personally I've kind of become more interested in and trying to educate myself on with regard to the big college football landscape or college athletics landscape. I also think like I don't know if I'm the Big Ten, I could see myself maybe pushing for a bigger cut of the cake or piece of the pie, whatever the expression is, because I feel like they are a very, very well-rounded conference when it comes to just overall excellence in sports. And the Pac-12, that kind of goes back to my point. Like they have a lot of stuff with a lot of ammunition when it comes to their presence in the Olympic sports, a lot of good, not great football teams. But they're also making some noise with hoops. So it's kind of just, I think it's going to reveal to a degree when we're evaluating these conferences, like who has strengths where and what sports, and how does that maybe enter the picture as far as, bargaining goes. So I'm not sure if that really went to your point necessarily. I'm just kind of saying stuff that comes to my head when it's a story this big. It's like, I feel like it's impossible to get every big part of it in one video as we are right now.
Yeah, it's going to be kind of the survival of the fittest, right? You're talking about, the SEC, they're kind of the first super conference adding Texas and Oklahoma. Maybe they get bigger if the Big 12 goes under. Now you have like group of 5 teams who have reached out to other Power 5 conferences. So who really knows how the conference, format's going to look a couple years from now, and if we'll even have conferences. So I think it's going to be survival of the fittest because the Pac-12 and ACC don't make what the SEC and the Big Ten make. I believe last year, even with the pandemic, I think the Big Ten made close to $300 million more than the AC or the Pac-12, which made probably less than $100 more than the ACC, which was kind of a surprise to me. So I think the Big Ten, if they get that TV deal, I feel like this alliance thing could kind of wash away. I'm not going to say, it won't happen because the Big Ten and the Pac-12 have tried to do something like this before. I believe it was 2011, but it kind of went under on the Pac-12 side. So I'm not 100% sure how formal this is going to be. I'm not sure when it's going to start because I know they said that they wanted to kind of honor the rest of their TV rights deals, which I think the last one is the Pac-12's, which expires in 2024, I believe. I'm not sure when the ACC's ends. But I think once they honor those, then we could really see this ramp up. But for now, I don't really know what's going to happen. It's not immediate. So I'm not really sure what the timeline of this looks like. But in terms of recruiting, I think that's one thing that, you have a big focus on and is very important in terms of Oregon, because you've talked about how Oregon kind of needs to take that next step. I think if this becomes formidable and, they play teams like Ohio State and Michigan regularly and Clemson, maybe even perhaps, then I think that could really boost their recruiting if they know that they can play against the best and not just the USCs and the UCLAs if you're a recruit from that perspective.
The Ducks are already recruiting at such a high level, but when you can market these big matchups on a consistent basis, that's going to definitely help, attract some recruits because they want to play on those big stages under the bright lights against those historic teams. Just to your point, it's like, are you just playing Ohio State with a home and home, or are you like, maybe we see them say, hey, we want a shot at Ohio State every year. Like that could potentially become a reality. And And I think that's a really good point, just to talk about the recruiting implications. It'll just help them, take their national brand even further. Mario Cristobal talking in practice today about kind of some of his initial reactions, although it was just really fresh today. But he was saying, we have a very national brand. And I think that an opportunity like this with the Alliance is just going to allow us to grow it even more and take it out there. And he was saying, we have ducks all over the country. So that just kind of goes back to the point of the recruiting benefits that could easily come from this. If you're flying across the country to play a team like Miami or something, or Florida State, for example, maybe you can get there a couple days early. And then when you're done practicing with your team, you can go look at some high school practices and check out some players over there. So that's something that I think is absolutely at play. And maybe we could see, more recruiting battles between some of these schools. I feel like we're already seeing a lot of them. I feel like the top schools for a lot of these top recruits, it's not that big of a surprise. You see them dealing with the likes of an Oregon and Alabama and Ohio State, Clemson. You see them in top lists together all the time. And I think the battle is on the recruiting trail is just going to get even more intense with this.
Yeah, 100%. I think you said Oregon is definitely a national brand. I think this gives an opportunity for other Pac-12 and maybe lower ACC teams to kind of become a national brand as well, in football anyway. I mean, like you could say Arizona is a national brand for basketball, and UCLA as well. But, I think this definitely boosts them for football recruiting, because you can play against, teams like Clemson and Ohio State and Wisconsin and Michigan and Iowa and that kind of thing. In Florida State, if they kind of make a comeback, like a lot of people expect them to. So, it's kind of the same thing with the SEC. Like, some people wonder why you would go to a Missouri or a Vanderbilt when they're kind of, scraping the bottom of the conference. Well, it's because you can be, playing against the best, like Alabama and Florida and Georgia and LSU. So I think that's kind of the similar case here. If you go to a team like you said, Washington State or Oregon State or Arizona, that you can kind of play against not just Oregon and USC, but, Ohio State and Clemson and that kind of stuff. So the other one thing that I wanted to talk about was like bowl games. The bowl tie-ins was kind of shoved aside, I think, in the presser and the press release. I'm not really sure what could come of those, because, the Rose Bowl has the Big Ten and the Pac-12, and, there are other ones that are slipping my mind right now as well. But, there's a lot of money in those bowl game tie-ins, especially the Rose Bowl. And then you talk about the college football playoff, that brings a lot of money to the conference and to the program as well. So with an expanded playoff and conference formats up in the air, it makes me wonder where all this money is going to go, because the SEC is going to make a lot of it, having so many teams in the playoff, and especially a 12-team playoff. They could realistically see half of the playoff be SEC teams. It's just a really interesting thing financially, how they say it's not a revenue thing, but I would say it's hugely based on that. Even though there's no sort of formal agreement, I think there will be. I don't know why they haven't talked about it, which is what George Kliavkoff said. I don't know. There's a lot to discuss there about the confusion of that. I think it's that was a head scratcher for me about that whole, not having a written agreement thing and not being based on revenue. Those were kind of the big kickers for me out of the presser.
It just kind of goes to show you how, you can try to prepare a statement, prepare for these questions and everything, and be on the same page with the other commissioners from the Big Ten and the ACC. But there's only so much that you can do when it comes to that. It just goes to show you how monumental of a move this is. With just so many different factors up in the air and so many unknowns. We don't even know when it's going to take hold. I think a point from to take away from it was that it's going to have to do with some current contracts in place as far as scheduling and media rights deals. I know that Kliavkoff said that he wants to get the Pac-12 either in some kind of a media rights deal with ESPN or Fox. Like, that's going to play a big part of everything. And it's kind of funny, like you can't help but think, if Larry Scott did a better job before he was here, with the Pac-12 being in this kind of a position where they're having to, go back to ESPN and say, hey, we're still trying to get our games and everything, televised on your network. But that's definitely a big piece of the puzzle. And I think when you're talking about the bowl games, that'll be interesting too. Like, are we going to see the opponents shift? The Rose Bowl is already the Pac-12 champion and the Big Ten champion. We could see the bowl landscape completely change. And the fact that this is going on with the potential expansion of, or at least the conversation of, I should say, expanding the playoff, it's just like we're getting hit with an absolute barrage of so many hypotheticals, so many unknowns. But I don't know. I mean, you don't get this in the NFL. Like, even though it's chaos, it's fun to follow, right? Because you just want to see how it's going to all shake out and who's going to come out on top, who's going to handle this kind of move. And this is also coming on the heels of NIL legislation. Like, we are just getting hit with everything, and it's so crazy to see unfold, and I'm here for it.
Yeah, if you would have told me during that Ohio State-Alabama national championship game that this offseason would be all of these storylines, I would have said you're nuts, because this offseason has definitely felt like the longest one. But there's just so much to follow. And, I think that's why we do stuff like this, is because there's so much unknowns and so much uncertainties that it's almost fun to kind of, concoct some hypotheticals and, that kind of stuff. So there's going to be a lot of information that comes from this, because this news only broke a couple of days ago. And then the Texas-Oklahoma thing, the NIL, college football playoff expansion, we're just, as college football fans, we're almost spoiled with how much change there is. It's just going to be interesting to see, the power balance of the SEC versus everybody else in this alliance, and, the NCAA's kind of role in it and their power kind of diminishing. And that's a whole other conversation. But, I think it's going to be a ton of fun to watch. I can't wait for Oregon to play teams like, Clemson and Ohio State every year, an Oregon-Wisconsin game that's not in the Rose Bowl. That would be fun to watch as well. So, yeah, I'm excited at how this is going to develop.
All the possible matchups are so exciting. All the directions it could go. It's definitely promising, but I think that there's probably going to be a fair amount of people out there that are just like, man, I don't know what to make of this. And I mean, neither do we, right? Like, that we're just kind of hopping on here and giving our 2 cents and, kind of rapid reactions. I'm sure more statements are going to come out from schools in the coming days and weeks. We'll get some more direction and sharpening of detail with reaction to all this news with regard to what's next for some of these schools. But just to wrap it up with a quick angle on Oregon, because we do talk about Oregon content here at Ducks Digest. Cristobal saying today that the Ducks begin preparations for Fresno State tomorrow with the season opener next Saturday. And, competition still running rampant through fall camp here in Eugene. He even said that there's a couple position battles that might even go on past next week, just because I'm paraphrasing here, but that was basically what he was saying, because there's just a lot of talent on this team, especially the battle between Triquez Bridges and Dante Manning. That's been one to follow for sure at corner. And then you got Adrian Jackson trying to become more of an every down kind of guy. He was talked about today, which was cool. Braden Swinson coming on as well. So there's a lot of stuff going on in Eugene, but, and this alliance is just another thing on top of it. What was I going to say? Oh, one more thing that we didn't talk about that I wanted to get to was just with regard to the schedule. That's such a big part of, I think, the Pac-12 and their postseason aspirations. Cristobal was asked today in the presser about, kind of his thoughts on, hey, do you think we should go from 9 games to 8 games? Like, what do you think about that? I think an 8-game conference schedule would be incredibly beneficial, because, like I said earlier in this video, the Pac-12 has a lot of good but not great teams. Like, we don't have that one team that's, dominant and just like top 10 and can compete against just about anybody in the country. It's looking like that should be Oregon, or maybe even USC for all we know. But just when we're talking about the Pac-12 kind of cannibalizing itself, especially late in the season, I feel like that's the area that I see 8 games being the most beneficial. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, I believe the ACC is doing 8 games. I think the Pac-12 and the Big Ten are both doing 9 this year. I don't know how that looks in the future. I know the Pac-12 is kind of set on 9. I don't know about the Big Ten, but I know that the Pac-12 commissioner said there's no intention as part of the alliance about like increasing the number of games in terms of the conference, or to stop them from being able to, schedule games against other conference opponents and stuff like that. It doesn't seem like that's going to shift anytime soon. Probably, like we said, at the end of those TV rights deals. But I think 8 is a solid number. I think 8 conference games and 4 non-con games, with 2 of them being against, the ACC and the Big Ten, and then you go Group of 5 or FCS or D2 or whatever you want to do. I think they'll have some flexibility from what I've read. So I think 8 is solid for everybody. I would definitely advocate for that, just because, like you said, the little guys, they have to get their money too, right? They have to build their program against teams like Oregon and Ohio State and Clemson, that kind of stuff. We have to, as fans, we enjoy that, yearly game of the Citadel against the Clemson or Alabama. They have to get their money too. They got to get that bag. So you got to respect that, and hopefully that can, stay put, because those teams need money too. So a lot of the financial stuff is up in the air. A lot of the scheduling, we don't know what it's going to look like. We were there, but we can't tell you all what's all going to come of this. And maybe they don't even know yet. So a lot to come from this.
Tons of stuff to figure out between this new regarding this new alliance between the Pac-12, Big Ten, and ACC. If you're watching this, we kindly ask that you subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're going to try to pump more of these out, working on getting some live stream capabilities set up here on the channel. So appreciate all the support. You can find more Oregon Ducks content at ducksdigest.com. You can find me on Twitter at my handle there, at mtorres sports rather. You can find Dylan on Twitter at DRK Sports News. We'll see what happens with this big alliance heading into the 2021 football season.